sequentially invite the speakers. Dr. Weinbaum, you're the first one, and we obviously expect you to share with us.
Well, I become the target, is that right?
Yes. And then that will be followed by Dr. Farhadi, and then General Ashfaq Nadeem Ahmad, and then Ambassador Jilani. So after these four speeches, which we expect to be around 12 to 15 minutes long, we'll have a 30-minute question and answer session. And then I'll request the Deputy President, Air Marshal Farhad Hussain Khan, to basically deliver the concluding address. And then I'll give the vote of thanks. So we are looking at something like 2 hours of useful and productive session. So any questions or anything you'd like to discuss before we formally start, sir? Anybody, sir? Nope. So Jilani, are you okay with the voice quality and everything?
Absolutely fine. Absolutely fine with me.
Great. That's great. We are just about to get underway. I'm waiting for my the technical staff to give me a go ahead, and then we'll be doing this Zoom session and also going live on social media. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good morning, and also good evening, depending upon where you are. This is your host, Syed Muhammad Ali. I am director at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. It is my great honor to host this very timely and important webinar, in which we have put together perhaps the best possible panel and the most formidable experts on Afghanistan. And because we all know that Afghanistan is right now undergoing a very fluid situation, and the situation is not only critical, but also deserves a timely and valuable and insightful review of the current situation and dynamics. And with the help of a very prestigious panel that we have today, we'll try to understand the current dynamics of Afghanistan and look at its implications and consequences for the region and also for Pakistan. The topic today is specifically future of Afghanistan, implications and options for Pakistan. So I'm sure that you all have heard a lot about Afghanistan in the last 42 years. So we will try not to discuss too much history, because I'm sure most of our followers and our friends are familiar with it. We'll try in the next 2 hours to concentrate more on understanding and deconstructing the current dynamics and how best, certain ideas and options can be explored and identified, which could be timely considered by all those who matter and can help the Afghan nation achieve peace, stability, and security, but also with the help of the regional countries and the neighbors, and not to mention the most important international powers, particularly the United States. So the context is interesting because 2-3 developments I'll just briefly share for the benefit of our friends who are watching us from around the world and joining us in this webinar, that the US President Biden's formal announcement of his decision to pull the US troops from Afghanistan has generated an intense international debate regarding Afghan future and its implications for regional stability, and with particular reference to Pakistan's national interest. And Pakistan, as you all are aware, is one of the key member of international community, which is consistently supporting the diplomatic efforts aimed at finding a peaceful, negotiated, and durable solution to the Afghan conflict. Therefore, the future of Afghanistan is likely to significantly influence not only the regional stability and security, but also Pakistan's ability to safely and timely develop itself, as well as develop a trans-regional economic corridor for the prosperity and progress of this region. Therefore, I am honored to briefly introduce our illustrious panel, which is joining us today to help understand this situation. First speaker today will be Professor Mervyn Weinbaum, perhaps the foremost authority on Afghanistan internationally, the most respected and sought after international expert on Afghanistan. Professor Weinbaum is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and served as an analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan in the US State Department from 1999 to 2003. He's currently Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute, Washington, DC. Our second speaker will be Dr. Tariq Farhadi. He's a former advisor to the President of Afghanistan. Dr. Farhadi has served as economic advisor to Afghan President Karzai. He has also served as senior advisor, Central Bank and Ministry of Finance in Kabul, Afghanistan. He has been the head of Investment Promotion Technical Assistance Program, Senior Strategy Officer and Economist at the World Bank, advisor to the Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund. And also he's an internationally respected political analyst. So we look forward to benefiting from him and his deep understanding of the socioeconomic dynamics and how best they can offer some hope and opportunity for the Afghan nation in future. The third speaker today is Lieutenant General Ishfaq Nadeem Ahmad. He's a former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army and considered to be one of the most thinking strategic experts in Pakistan. Earlier, he commanded the 2 Corps of Pakistan Army and has also served as the Director General of Military Operations and Chief of Staff of 1 Corps. He was responsible for planning Pakistan Army's famous Operation Zarbiaz during his tenure as DGMO. Earlier, he has also commanded a strike infantry division and led successful military operations in Swat. I think he is perhaps the brain and also the commander who led the most decisive battle against terrorism at a very critical time in Pakistan's history. So we are really honored to have him here and join us, and we'll benefit from his insight, experience in order to forecast and predict the security implications for Pakistan and how best we can address them. The fourth speaker today will be my honorable and distinguished colleague, Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani, who's a former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan and has also served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union, and Australia as well. Ambassador Jilani has served as the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, and he has also, without any ado, basically considered to be the leading authority in the diplomatic circles on South Asia by virtue of serving as Director General of South Asia and SAARC, Deputy High Commissioner to India, and Director India in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He, in 2018, was nominated by the government of Pakistan as a member of experts and eminent persons group of the ASEAN Regional Forum, and later in 2019 as member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs. Most recently, he has served as a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, UK, and USIP, USA. So it's my great honor to welcome you all, and we'll benefit from Ambassador Gilani's great insight into not only in South Asian security affairs, but also his deep understanding of international power politics and the US and its implication for the geopolitical dynamics of this region in the context of Afghanistan. The chair of today's webinar is the Deputy President of Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, Air Marshal Farhat Hussain Khan, Hilal Imtiaz Military. He's a former Vice Chief of Air Staff of Pakistan Air Force, and he was commissioned in the GDP branch of PAF in March 1977. And after commissioning, he has served as a fighter pilot in various frontline fighter squadrons. During his service, he remained on various important command and staff appointments. His command assignments included command of a fighter squadron, a fighter wing, and an operational PF base. His appointments at Air Headquarters included Additional Director General Air Force Strategic Command, Chief Project Director of the JF-17 Thunder Program, and Vice Chief of the Air Staff, an appointment he held till his retirement in July 2013. He also served as Chairman Pakistan Aeronautical Complex Board at Kamra. He has been President of the Ski Federation of Pakistan. He served on Civil Aviation Authority Board and Chairman Monitoring Committee of Pakistan and Multan Airport. He has also served as Pakistan's Air Attaché in New Delhi, India. He has also co-authored 2 books, The Aviation City and Milestones, about the growth of military aviation industry in Pakistan and its way forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have put together a very illustrious panel. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Mervyn Weinbaum, Director of Afghan and Pakistan Studies, Middle East Institute, Washington, DC, to give us an insight on the US perspective regarding the future of Afghanistan. What are the US plans after the military departure? Is there going to be a complete military departure? And in future, how best can the world deal with this situation, and what are the opportunities that we can best seize to learn from history? So, Professor Weinbaum, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to structure my remarks around the topic which I believe was suggested, looking at the future of Afghanistan. And hopefully this will serve as a framework for much of our discussion. I think it's useful here in trying to forecast what is going to happen through the short run and the medium run. I think we'll leave out the long run necessarily, but to separate out what do we think we know about Afghanistan and what's likely to happen from those developments which seem at this point unknown to us. And I'd like to conclude by then suggesting what I think are the most probable scenarios in some order of their probability. And let me start by saying that I think we're all agreed that US and NATO forces will be gone by September 11th, if not sooner. And there appears to be the fact that there'll be no residual ground presence of foreign forces. This was really not really fully appreciated while much of the discussion about what the US was going to do was going on. Whether there certainly was no provision for it, but the military in the United States, as well as many in the State Department and within the White House also, were arguing for the necessity to keep at least a small contingent of forces for counterterrorism purposes. This was a red line for the Taliban, and the US finally, in its decision on what to do, has made no indication here of the fact that there would be any boots on the ground, as they say. Secondly, I think we could accept the fact that the Taliban are presently operating from a position of military strength. From what we know, they are in a position here to mount attacks on all of the provincial capitals pretty much, as well as the national capital. They have positioned themselves particularly well to cut off all traffic and to co-opt areas that we thought were going to be secure. The situation in this sense is viewed by many people as rather dire, particularly given the third possibility here is that there's going to be an upsurge in violence. Already violence, as we all know, has been at a far greater intensity than we had hoped for with the beginning of peace talks. But the fact is that we have seen more violence since the signing of a US Taliban agreement in February of 2020 than we did previously. It's taken a particularly heavy toll on the security forces, but also has not spared the civilian population. These figures have really mounted, and every expectation is that there will be a renewed campaign on the Taliban's part once the foreign forces are gone. Fourth, I'm going to assert here as a given that there will be no negotiated peace agreement with the Taliban, not certainly of the grand bargain variety. It seems clear that the Taliban are not now and have never really been interested in power sharing if that meant making serious compromises on the demands that they have had set forth from the very beginning. They have not given up, nor have they ever claimed that they would, on the restoration of an emirate. And I would submit to you that there is in this conflict the kind of conflict that we see elsewhere as well. This is not unique. And that is, this is not a fight for territory. This is not a fight for power for its own sake, but is rather a fight over values. There are two different conceptions here about what the Afghan state should look like, two different perspectives on two different visions on what Afghanistan is about. And I think that this shares with all of those other conflicts, of which we could name several, which have never been resolved except in that one side ultimately won and the other side lost. Now, I think what you'll see finally in what we can anticipate here with a certain degree of certainty is that the talks will revive. Indeed, I understand now there was a second round just yesterday, and we can anticipate this. And I suggest this is the case because the Taliban have for some time now recognized the possibility that they can, over the long run, they believe, reach ascendancy militarily, but this will be long and difficult. and that there is a shortcut to this, and that is through diplomatic or political means that they can reach what they aspire to, as I say, in the way of political dominance. An emirate, it will be different than the emirate of the 90s to some extent, in that it would be more inclusive of other groups, but at the same time, it would be entirely on the Taliban's terms. This would not be anything that they would have to or feel that they were inclined to compromise on. So there are other things that we could perhaps identify as being can hold with reasonable degree of certainty. But let me go on and suggest what I think we really don't have a good understanding about what is going to transpire. How long can the ANSF, the Afghan National Security Force, how long can it sustain itself? Will it be able to stand up for any length of time against this Taliban assault, which we anticipate is coming shortly? Or will it experience something which it has experiencing regularly here, and that is the gradual unraveling of it mainly through desertions? And would these increase with the intensity of the conflict? And necessarily, what we're talking about here is that really, as we look at the future of the political system, the government and the political system, it hinges on the success of the defense forces to stand up. And that's not all that's going to be needed for success, but that is a sine qua non. We don't know at this point to what extent the United States is going to have its follow through on what it says is its commitment to Afghanistan of a non-military sort. We hear talk about maintaining an over-the-horizon air power against, at first we thought it was just going to be against Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, but now it seems as if it has been broadened also to include the Taliban. So in this sense, the United States would have a military role to play. However, in doing it over the horizon or offshore, as is also referred to, in doing it this way, there's no question that its effectiveness, providing close air support, which has been so critical here to the stabilization of the situation in Afghanistan militarily, whether that in any way will continue. Most of the experts on this have doubts in this regard. Thirdly here, how long will the already fatigued international community continue to provide resources? We see here just yesterday, the Australians are pulling out their embassy from Kabul. And we have seen certainly that all of the NATO countries and Turkey as well, and there was some doubt about that, are not going to remain once the main force of international military presence is gone. This is important here, particularly militarily, as I suggest, but also financially, naturally. Without the finances to support the NSFF, there is not going to be a viable Afghan military response to the Taliban and to Islamic State. Then there's also the question of what role will the neighbors play, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and behind them, the Russians, China, India, Saudi Arabia. All of them pretty much in the past have had a role. If we go back to the 90s, we're aware of this. And we're also aware of the fact that under certain conditions, they may themselves become involved in a future conflict. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. But the importance here of the international community not to resolve it. They cannot, the neighbors cannot bring peace. But on the other hand, it's hard to imagine a successful Afghanistan, both its political existence as well as its economic success without the neighbors. The neighbors are absolutely critical for the success of any Afghan state. Are they going to are they going to be helpful? Can they be on the same page, which they have not in the past? Or will they be spoilers, as they have at times in the past, and actually indirectly been participants in the conflict, as occurred in the 1990s? And then finally, in these unknowns, I would put here, what can the Afghan political elite do itself? So much of what would be necessary to emerge from this with some confidence, just to maintain the stability that's needed over the next few years in order, if nothing else, to buy time, to strengthen the military forces and to resolve differences. Can this be done? It seems difficult for me to imagine that there can be any success here unless the various factions which have been at such odds are able to pull together. And we have one hopeful development. Again, we've had many false signs here, but the establishment of the State Supreme Council perhaps suggests here that there is a recognition that unless they stand together, they will fall apart separately. So this is, again, I think that the odds for this, given the past, are not great. But this again, in order to maintain any hope at all, considering the fact then that the military is able to do its part, is going to be equally important. Finally, let me now look at some of the broad scenarios as I see it. One, that the Taliban can be defeated militarily. Let me go from the least likely to what I think is the most probable. The Taliban can be defeated militarily. I don't think anyone seriously predicts this, at least given the current alignment of forces. It's only slightly more probable that if time were bought, that it would be possible, by unifying itself, able to deliver for the people. What I'm getting at here is to rebuild the confidence of the Afghan people in their government and its capacity to make their lives safer and provide jobs particularly. If this could be accomplished, then there's a possibility here, no, not of reconciliation with the Taliban, but of reintegration. And that is peeling off the opposition, not the hardcore, but the fighters who are in it for a variety of reasons. And we would classify them, therefore, as non-ideological by comparison with some of the leadership. Secondly, that the Taliban is able in the very near future to completely overrun the government and consolidate power. Well, I don't know to what extent it may have success in capturing territory now held by or controlled by the government, but the idea that they can consolidate power seems to me highly unlikely. The reason being that even were the government in Kabul to collapse, there are today power brokers who have their own militias who are prepared to stand and fight against the Taliban and will do so much more effectively, even though they won't have a leader like Massoud. They will do so much more effectively because they will get the deserters from the Afghan security force, getting them to return with their arms, their know-how, and we can look forward then to a very different kind of at least a holding off of the Taliban for a period of time. Thirdly, the current standoff between the government and the Taliban forces continues indefinitely. And that means that the government will be able to maintain its control over the population centers, and that the Taliban will have, as it has now, the run of much of the rural area. That is certainly a greater possibility than the first two. Fourth, that with the Taliban unable to consolidate power, the country dissolves into an open-ended, chaotic civil war. This is the worst of all possibilities, the nightmare of Afghans, and really it should be the nightmare of the region and globally as such. This could turn into something far more intense, far more with possibilities here of its expanding beyond Afghanistan than anything we saw in the 1990s. This would not be easily contained, and that's a subject in itself. But it is possible if the military should dissolve, if the political elite is unable to reach a degree of accommodation among themselves, reconciliation among themselves, if the warlords fall back on their armed militias, as I suggest, if neighboring countries become involved through proxies, as some did in the 1990s, and then on top of that, we have the possible effects, serious effects of having millions of refugees. And I think that this has been underplayed here. There are already 600,000 refugees in Turkey. Given some figures I just saw today, this is going to increase. Pakistan has put up a fence, but that won't matter if millions are trying to make it to the borders. There were approximately 6 million refugees earlier in the 80s and 90s. And that was when the population was in 1980, 1/3 of what it is today. So what I'm leaving you then with here is unfortunately, the potential here for a protracted civil war. And this is what we ought to, as we examine what can be done, this is what we ought to keep in mind about the potential here for this kind of outcome and how everyone would suffer as a result of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Weinbaum, for a very well-structured, comprehensive, and candid analysis. I think you have set the stage very well and laid out the different aspects that I'm sure the next few speakers will address more deeply. And perhaps the last point that you made after a very logical and well-structured analysis, that protracted civil war perhaps seems to be more likely than the other possible scenarios that you developed. And that is perhaps the most important question for our next speaker, Dr. Tariq Farhadi, the former advisor to the President of Afghanistan, to address. That first off, obviously, we'll expect Dr. Farhadi to give his perspective of the emerging scenario of Afghanistan and how best we can minimize its negative implications for Afghan nation and for neighbors. But also, do you agree with the somewhat realist and pessimist view that Professor Weinbaum very aptly summarized? And also, Dr. Farhadi, do you see the peace process as actually a process, or it is just something which is going through the motions? And how do you see the future of the Kabul administration and the allegations of corruption and its influence over the rest of the territory? So, Dr. Farhadi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me tonight with illustrious participants. And I present my greetings to our Pakistani sisters and brothers that are watching this program, because they are interested in what's happening in the neighboring country of Afghanistan. I will answer your questions, sir. May I just do a short introduction on what are the opportunities for the future in Afghanistan? I see the opportunities for the future in Afghanistan to build a joint partnership with Pakistan. Pakistan is an important neighbor to Afghanistan. And how can we build a future of peaceful partnership that the two nations can live next to each other, sovereign nations, and be good for each other. So after all the miscalculations that our joint history has had by our politicians, most of our politicians have had mercurial characters, and history will demonstrate that mercurial characters can have more negative and malignant long-term effects between the relations between the two countries than anything else. But because we are here thinking about the future, please allow me to talk about 4 areas where, if we cooperated as two countries, the scenario of civil war also could be minimized, and all the negative scenarios could be minimized, although they are realistic scenarios, as explained by Dr. Weinbaum. For that, I would talk 2 minutes about each area: trade and trade potential and complementarities. I'll talk about culture, tourism, environment, and climate. I'll talk about security. I'll talk about people-to-people linkages, and then I'll talk about security. So first, on trade. Look, there was a time where Pakistan exported $4 billion worth of goods to Afghanistan. And Pakistan's exports right now stand about $23 billion. So that means that close to a quarter of exports of Pakistan was to Afghanistan. And this was not all the potential. Why? Because it never got to reach really Central Asia. If you add trade to Afghanistan at 4 billion, and if you add the potential for the Central Asian countries, not only Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, but also through this, Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan and perhaps Kazakhstan, if there was a peaceful situation, the trade potential from Pakistan to Afghanistan and through Afghanistan is about $8 billion. That's 40% of Pakistan's exports. So there is an opportunity to trade more to Afghanistan beyond Afghanistan through a peaceful and friendly Afghanistan. One. Of course, complementarities exist between the two countries. Pakistan has an industry which is very developed in textile and leather and other small manufacturing. And Afghanistan has a labor force as well. Especially in southern Afghanistan, our labor force has worked in the Gulf countries. So there's a lot of training that here could be brought to bear and benefit both countries. There is a project at the US Senate right now called the Special Economic Zones, SEZs, to be, if it's approved by Congress, to have industries that could make textile products for export to the United States duty-free. This is only just a limited part of what we can do together. We can do much more and export to the rest of the world, including to Europe, because Afghanistan has the types of dried fruits that perhaps don't grow in Pakistan and vice versa. So there's a lot of potential, not only what the SEZ project forecasts with the US project, but between the two countries, the potential for the future is humongous. Of course, it has to be a peaceful relationship and friendly relationship. So that is the trade potential, the complementarities. One more point. The Karachi Stock Exchange also could be a host to some public offerings of Afghan corporations, and there we can attract capital from the Gulf, from Asia, and this will be good for business. This will be good for the Karachi Stock Exchange and for Pakistan and for Afghanistan. These are the potential points. Then allow me to talk about culture and environment and climate. Well, both countries are subject to a climate crisis. Climate crisis knows no borders. Just like our common crisis that we have today, unfortunately, is the polio crisis, which knows no borders. But on the positive side, we can do a lot of work on the water issue, on climate, on regeneration of energy. Both countries have areas with mountains. Our chair, Farhat Hussain Khan, I was pleased to see that has been the head of the ski federation. Imagine for a moment, sir, if we brought the world's tourism to Afghanistan and Pakistan together, and we created treks for tourism. Obviously, in Pakistan, tourism was very limited in the last few years. Perhaps last year, we can't count really last year because of the COVID situation, but before that, about 800,000 people arrived as tourists in Pakistan. Most of them are Pakistanis who have a different citizenship, and when they come in at the airport in Islamabad or Karachi, they sign tourist, but they have a US passport or something else. But real tourism has been limited under its potential. It could be much more, and it could bring a lot of money to Pakistan, to the region, to Afghanistan. For that, we need two things. We need peace, and we need to deal with extremism. Extremism, as the general Nadeem Ahmad, who led the Zarb-e-Azb operation, would say to us, these are areas that could be touristic areas if there was peace. When will we have peace? When can we deal with extremism? Extremism is a menace for Afghanistan. It is a menace for Pakistan as well. We have seen it in bombings in Quetta and Karachi and Peshawar and elsewhere. If this extremism situation is not controlled in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the region will suffer. So in order to attract tourists, not only Pakistani diaspora, or Gulf tourists, we have to be able to deal with the issue of terrorism and the images of both our countries. Both our countries suffer from an image that Western tourists are not coming right now, but we could change that. And we could have tourism in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and have joint treks in order to bring millions of people. The potential exists because we have the nature, the climate, the mountains, the ski slopes, and whatnot. And this brings me to the third part of potential that we have between the two countries, which is the people to people. We are grateful that since 42 years, Pakistan has hosted close to 5-6 million refugees. It has hosted, in fact, more refugees because a lot of people came through Pakistan and then went on to Germany, Europe, the United States, and Australia. So Pakistan has been a host to, in reality, to more than 6 million people. And we are grateful for that and for the hospitality of the Pakistani sisters and brothers. And we also have now refugees that are in Pakistan who benefit from the education system, from the infrastructure. And in Afghanistan, in the past 20 years, a number of young Afghans who have been back and who are running the government and the private sector have benefited from the Pakistani education sector. This has more potential in a peaceful environment of exchange, which takes me to the, and there has been marriages, of course. Even if we wanted to be separate, we couldn't be separate now because the interwoven type of our relationship is too deep now, has been too deep in the past history, but in our recent history of the 2 decades, it has been deep. It has to be exploited in the positive way. The fourth area is security. Of course, security is the crux of the situation. Pakistan has security interests in Afghanistan. We understand it, we acknowledge it. Pakistan sees the Indian influence in Afghanistan as a risk. We can talk about that. In my opinion, it shouldn't be a risk. It is not a risk. Afghanistan has relations with India as it should have relations with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, anywhere. But we can also work in a way that our relationship with India is in a way that can also be acceptable to Pakistan. And we have to keep a small door because someday Pakistan and India might make peace. So all of these scenarios are possible. And if Pakistan and India made peace, there also the economic potential is humongous. So I see this as the South Asia region. Afghanistan also has security interests in Pakistan. Why? The Taliban leaders live in Pakistan. And the Pakistani government acknowledges that they live in Pakistan. If there was a paradigm change, then yes, Pakistan does have the possibility and the influence to pressure the Taliban leaders to go towards a peaceful settlement and not follow the path that was described by Dr. Weinbaum. In that regard, may I say that I appreciate Foreign Minister Qureshi's recent declarations at the parliament, who said, the Afghans have to decide what they want from us. What they want from us. One day it's blame, one day it's offers of hugs. I, as an individual Afghan, would like one message. I would like to give one message to Foreign Minister Qureshi, for the government of Pakistan and for the military establishment, to tell the Taliban that if you want to arrive by force in government in Afghanistan, Pakistan will not recognize a government that arrives by force. Pakistan has said this. In other words, it has said that we want a political settlement in Afghanistan. We agree that there is a need for a political settlement in Afghanistan, the Taliban's or Afghans as well. There is a need for a political settlement, but there is a need for this message to Taliban to go one step further, to tell the Taliban, now the foreigners are gone, the Americans are gone. Now, if you want to fight, and if there is a civil war in Afghanistan, it is not going to be to the benefit of Pakistan, because all the trade potential, the economic potential, the cultural potential, the tourism potential, all of that will be postponed for a few decades. We will all lose out. With violence and extremism in the region, we will all lose out. It could be told to the Taliban that if your intention is to arrive by force and get to be at the seat of the government in Afghanistan by force, Pakistan will not recognize you. That will throw cold water on the ideas that they have, that now they have won this big war and now they're going to overthrow the government in Kabul. Kabul also has changed. There's a lot of young population in Kabul. The big cities are not going to fall easily in Afghanistan to Taliban. Yes, swaths of territory have already fallen to Taliban in Afghanistan. Parts of other provinces might fall, but the fight for Kabul will be very long, very hard, and inconclusive, actually. It is not sure the Taliban might win this war, not at all. Because there will be a mobilization of the people against them if they want to push by violence. The people will be afraid of them and will mobilize around the government and potentially leaders and fight them. And there's a lot of economic interests now in Afghanistan. In the last 20 years, a lot of Afghans have gotten very rich, actually. There are Afghans who have $300, $400 million in their bank account as a result of the intervention of the United States. And these people hire militias, actually, and fight against the Taliban. Why? Because they want to preserve their economic interests. They don't want the Taliban to come in and take the power and start asking questions, where did you get your wealth? Even some of the wealth is outside, but these are Afghans. They are never going to let the Taliban win again, because we have had this experience one time where Kabul was evacuated for the Taliban. This time, it will be a fight. There is no guarantee that the Taliban will win. They need to understand that. And it's not good for Pakistan. And the whole region will look bad for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world will avoid us, the Afghans and the Pakistanis. We don't want that. We want actually to turn the paradigm and make this a zone of opportunity, a zone of trade and commerce and transit, and a zone that welcomes other people. For that, there is a need to deal with the Taliban in Pakistan. There is a need to deal with extremism in the region. That's my remarks. I don't know if I have answered all the questions, sir. Civil war, yes, it's a possibility, but I think here I have laid out a scenario where we can avoid it if Pakistan put one more notch of pressure on Taliban.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farhadi. A very comprehensive analysis of the current scenario in Afghanistan, and also an assessment of the future prospects, and also identifying some very useful areas and avenues in which Pakistan and Afghanistan can cooperate, particularly trade, culture, environment, tourism, and also security. I'll leave you to think about how the Afghan nation can themselves try to recover from the war economy and build a normal nation state. While I move to the third speaker, and maybe you can address that during the Q&A session. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the US perspective regarding the Afghan future, and also both the concerns, options, and assessment from a leading Afghan expert. Now it brings me basically to invite a leading strategic thinker of Pakistan, Lieutenant General Ashfaq Nadeem Ahmad, former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army, to give his perspective regarding the future security dynamics of Afghanistan and its geostrategic implications for Pakistan. I'll request General Saab to give assessment of the security environment and how it is likely to affect the region and Pakistan, and how best we can address it before the consequences become more harmful. So, General Nadeem, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First up, I would like to thank the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies for providing us this opportunity. Some very interesting remarks, both by Professor Marvin and Dr. Farhadi. Unfortunately, you can call it a realist view or a pessimist view, but I'll try and be as candid as possible. What I'll do is that I have sort of structured my talk around 6 areas. First is the magnitude of the comprehensive peace agreement, which for ease I'll call the CPA, and within which is the intra-Afghan dialogue, the implementation of any peace agreement, the challenges associated with that, the ability or the capability of the Afghan National Security Forces, which Professor Marvin also mentioned. I'll just talk about our scenario, which I feel is the most likely scenario, and cover some implications of that scenario itself. As we are all aware that the departure of the US forces will have policy ramifications far and wide. They'll reach China, Russia, India, Iran, Pakistan, USA, NATO, will all be affected. USA's future military interventions, I believe, will be in retreat due to the Afghan experience. How the Afghan forces for the next few years, how will they react, and how Afghanistan fares in the next few years will have a lasting impact on US foreign policy, especially its desire for military interventions. Will the peace process be achieved? Number one, will the peace process succeed? I recall a few years into combat operations post 9/11, the Taliban were known to have famously said, "You may have the watches, but we have the time." Let there be no doubt that this longest war, military involvement of USA, longer even than Vietnam, has failed. All of us have failed. And we have failed in our objectives. We have tried to modify the objectives as we went along, and because it suited us. Even if it is termed as a stalemate from a military perspective and from the view of the experts, stalemate is always considered to be a victory for the insurgents. There is no doubt that US in its own parlance is about to cut and run. It is all set to achieve an artificial closure. It is not a condition-based withdrawal. It is not even a responsible one. And therefore, most of the countries have been suggesting to the USA for the withdrawal to be condition-based and a responsible one. Before I talk about the future of Afghanistan, it is important to conclude if a CPA, which is the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, of which intra-Afghan dialogue is one part, can actually be reached. Whether this CPA can be reached by September of this year, that's the main question. It is now obvious that USA is leaving regardless of the peace agreement. The agreement signed between the Taliban and the US in February of 2020 is only the first step. And in my opinion, it is only a brief agreement. It does not cover so many details which it should have. A CPA, which is a comprehensive peace agreement, would entail several agreements within it. First, obviously, is the Taliban-US agreement. The second, it has to be ratified by NATO. The third is the intra-Afghan dialogue, which is ongoing currently. the Taliban and the Afghan. And it should be supported, in my opinion, by all Afghan pro-government forces while signing that agreement. There then has to be, in my opinion, should be maybe a Pakistan-Afghanistan agreement for Pakistan to reiterate, which Pakistan has been saying repeatedly, that peace in Afghanistan is peace in Pakistan. There may be a requirement of that. And there should also be a declaration by supporting states, i.e. friends of Afghanistan, who say that they are willing to support all that is happening with regard to Afghanistan post the US departure. And then there has to be a financial commitment by USA and its allies and some of the other developed countries to support Afghanistan subsequently as it struggles to stand on its own feet. For a CPA to succeed, it has to encompass cessation of hostilities. It has political and security power sharing, troops as withdrawal, constitutional reform, transition methodology, extremely important, and implementation mechanism, which itself will be challenging. The intra-Afghan dialogue itself remains extremely challenging. I feel without USA's handholding, it may not succeed. Pakistan may also have to remain actively involved, but Pakistan, I feel, would be reluctant out of fear of being scapegoated, which it has been previously, it has experienced. So Pakistan may actually be reluctant there. It is also in US's interest to be able to do that so as to actually, in my opinion, delay the inevitable. What that inevitable is, I'll come to in a moment. I'm glad that the USA, my personal experience, that instead of saying that the peace process should be Afghan-led, they started talking to the Taliban directly, and therefore they have succeeded. And now they need to actually continue to sort of nudge the peace agreement further, and then eventually hoping that the Afghans would eventually own it as well. So I feel that there is no such thing as Afghan-led at this stage, but it must remain Afghan-owned subsequently and for the long term. The plan proposed by President Ashraf Ghani, in which he himself remains the president, oversees the elections, does not contest himself, and promises to leave in favor of the winner of the presidential election, I feel is a non-starter, because the Taliban would not accept elections under the current constitution, I suspect, and not under the presidentship of President Ashraf Ghani. Taliban government, as well as some of the other Afghan players, have in the past benefited from the war economy, from which sometimes money has been conveniently siphoned off. There is fear amongst these players that as and when USA withdraws, the inflow of money would stop and their quote-unquote livelihood would potentially be compromised. Hence, the vested interest for status quo. Thus, an intra-Afghan agreement within an overall comprehensive peace agreement, in my opinion, remains elusive at best. Even if there is a political settlement by September, the implementation of it would remain fraught with difficulties. The Taliban, in all probability, would like to take control of the government as well as maximum of Afghan's districts. As things stand today, Taliban are in control of a substantial area. Because a single stakeholder cannot guarantee the stability vis-a-vis the implementation of the peace agreement, this will remain extremely challenging. The challenge for USA is that it cannot hold Taliban to account for fulfilling their end of the bargain once USA's forces have left. And I think this is the biggest mistake that USA is making, that rather than it being a gradual departure, there will be no one responsible for ensuring that the Taliban agree and implement what has been decided. And then there will be scapegoating. People will blame USA. USA will blame perhaps Pakistan, as would Afghans, as Dr. Farhadi was also mentioning. The challenge currently is that we are actually, in my opinion, still looking at Taliban as the enemies, and which begins to create doubts and difficulties for the peace process. And therefore, I suspect, although I feel that the Taliban may have a thing or two up their sleeves, but at this point where the peace process stands, the Taliban, in my opinion, have to be looked at not as an enemy. They may eventually become one subsequently, but at this point, I think it would be wrong to do that. Now, a few words on the ANSF. And I can speak from a degree of experience that I've been involved once the ANSF was being raised a few years back, and being raised as a national army. The ANSF's representation right now covers most of the ethnicities, especially in the officers class. So there are about, if we include the police, 288,000 or so people, although the actual strength is over 500,000, I believe. But currently, that's the strength. And therefore, this strength, because of the ethnicities involved, which is a good thing for a national army, but when it comes under pressure, the ANSF, I feel, and I am very sort of sorry to be saying that, but I suspect that it will actually begin to disintegrate. And we are already hearing that Ahmad Shah Massoud's son is already intelligence report suggesting, I was reading in the newspapers the other day, that they have started acquiring weapons. And those weapons eventually are meant to obviously protect the Northern Alliance, the erstwhile Northern Alliance, or the ethnicities within it. So that would also create difficulties. And the moment there is greater pressure from the Taliban, military pressure, post the withdrawal, so there is a good potential, in my opinion, or fear, that some percentage of these ethnicities may abandon the Afghan army. And that would not be limited to these ethnicities. I suspect that even some of the Pashtuns may actually decide. Eventually, in any combat, people would be willing to side with the power which is considered to be winning or is likely to win, and protect their life, limb, and property. So if it's the government and the ANSF stands firm, people would stand with them. And if they're not, they may not be willing to stand with the Taliban, but they'll be coerced into doing that. Will Congress be willing to provide $5 to $6 billion, which is the average amount which has been paid to the Afghan National Security Forces over these years, especially once USA has left? I don't think that's a possibility. And that is an issue I can tell you from first-hand experience that has been raised or had been raised repeatedly with our American friends since that time they set out to set up the Afghan National Army. In the interest of time, I'll skip a few things which my worthy speakers have already covered. The Afghan army currently has an attrition rate of 30% per year. And this attrition rate, I feel, could potentially increase after the USA's withdrawal because of the challenges, because there'll be more combat operations, and because there has to be money needed for the salaries to be paid and all. And I hope that there'll be a commitment by the US and its allies with regard to civilian financial assistance in the future. Taliban actually, on the other hand, have traditionally resourced their fight over the years through drugs, mining, taxation, and by capturing equipment through attacks on government-controlled checkpoints. They have had external support as well. And therefore, they have proved to be a resilient enemy, one which has engaged in strategic planning and coordination. It is also important to reiterate, I'm sure everyone knows, that a peace deal has not been sought by Taliban, but by the US. By agreeing to a date for withdrawal, the control has firmly been ceded to the Taliban, who may continue to play along, and this is important, what I'm about to say, who may continue to play along until the departure of all US forces and thereafter lose all interest and motivation for a peace agreement or implementation of it, whether it has been finalized prior to the US departure or not. Even if the Taliban leadership itself was convinced for a peace deal, it would be extremely difficult for them to convince their rank and file as they sense a clear victory. And I say this, I'll not say that this is based on first-hand experience, but this is based on nearly first-hand experience that when Pakistan is expected from Pakistan to push Taliban into negotiations and talks, the Taliban response, and Pakistan, I would reiterate, has a degree of limited influence over Taliban, much less than is expected in Afghanistan or thought so by the US side or the allies. So the response was, this is, I'm talking about a few years back, the response, and I'm sure Mr. Farhadi would know this, the Taliban response was that having fasted all day, you expect us to break the fast half an hour or 30 minutes before the formal ending of the fast, when they were asked to actually go into this peace talks and all. So what is likely to happen, that this may eventually cause either of the following: one, splintering of the Taliban, further complicating the peace process. I have said this previously, and I would like to reiterate at this forum as well. Any splintering of the Taliban would complicate the peace process or stability of Afghanistan. Two, the Taliban leadership may renege on any agreement to retain unity amongst their ranks. Having mentioned some of the complexities, allow me to give a scenario which is extremely pessimistic. I hope I am wrong. I pray I am wrong, but I feel that a comprehensive peace agreement will elude us. Even if we get to the peace agreement, it will eventually fail. Afghanistan will unfortunately, most likely, descend into a chaotic civil war with Taliban as the dominant player with control of Kabul. I would beg to disagree with probably Dr. Farhadi said that, with control of Kabul as well as some of the provinces. The current government will potentially be overthrown, and the Afghan military, I feel, could possibly disintegrate. There will, however, be islands of comparative stability, stabilized by local warlords and their militias, as was highlighted that those militias would fight the Taliban. But whether they fight them or not, there would be, that is what I'm saying, that there would be a civil war. So even if there are militias who are paid by certain quarters to fight the Taliban, so there would be a civil war. Afghanistan, in all probability, would replicate the violence which broke out in Iraq when the Americans left. And please remember that in Iraq, there had been a clear military victory, which cannot be said for Afghanistan right now. The time within which this deterioration would occur, I feel that it will probably be a year to 2 years. Can this scenario be avoided? Yes, in my opinion, it can be avoided. And the only way that it can be mitigated is by a delay in the departure of the US troops till such time that the elections are held, the transitional government is in place, and so on and so forth. But that is not going to happen. So I'll not go into the details because the USA has already decided to leave. If the Taliban were to come in power, whether through a democratic process of elections or through the use of force, my expectation is that their manner of governance would be somewhat less intense than the last time. This expectation is based on two primary reasons. Firstly, Afghan government over the past few years has self-generated only $800 million per year, depending for the remaining on financial assistance from friends outside. Taliban understand this and would, I feel, want for this financial support to continue to whatever degree possible. Secondly, they have learned from past experience that an extreme form of governance could not only dry up external funding, but may also get United Nations and other countries to get involved militarily, not at this stage, but more actively with concomitant complications for the Taliban. As was evident from the recent Taliban Amir's Eid al-Fitr message, which some of you may have gone through, there possibly may be flexibility with regard to girls' education, minority rights, physical amputation, and capital punishments. Due to the political and security vacuum, regional countries like Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, India would get more actively involved, and proxies would be played out in Afghanistan potentially. The most significant proxy, as Mr. Farhadi was saying, would be that of India and Pakistan, which could lead to deterioration of relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also between India and Pakistan. Despite Taliban's dislike for ISIS, the latter would be able, in my humble opinion, be able to find sanctuary and support within Afghanistan and may actually thrive with possible support from countries which are opposed to Taliban rule, and also from potential militias within Afghanistan who, as Mr. Farhadi was saying, may be paid by certain powers that could then, but the problem is that would eventually also lead to the civil war that we are dreading. This does not mean that ISIS would pose any serious threat to Taliban, but they may be able to control some limited areas. The erstwhile Northern Alliance I have already referred to, and there are reports that it's being formalized yet again. The US administrations, current as well as past, will be extensively blamed for wasting the taxpayers' money for over 2 decades, suffering extensive casualties without adequate results. The failure in Afghanistan, coming on the heels of Iraq, would add insult to injury. This pattern would be repeated in other major NATO and European countries. All this will result in reduced military involvements in the near future at least. USA, I would suspect, would try counter-terrorism operations, and it may plan on counter-terrorism operations from outside Afghanistan, elsewhere from the Gulf, for which they would need the airlines of communications, etc. And I believe, I have no proof of that, but I believe that they may be talking to the Pakistani government for airlines of communication right now as we speak. And there would be a possible exodus of refugees, most to Pakistan and some to Iran, creating social, financial, and security challenges yet again, and keeping Pakistan and Iran in the forefront for some years to come. Pakistan will be blamed yet again for not exercising its influence over Taliban to prevent deterioration of the situation. Pakistan, in response, will try to absolve itself of such scapegoating. This could bring Pakistan-US relations under stress. And lastly, the chaos in Afghanistan would impact Pakistan's security. Despite having set up a fence on the Afghan-Pakistan border, some militant groups may try to use Pakistani territory for logistics, etc. And the youth of the border towns on the Pakistani side may be, the Taliban may try to recruit some of the youth to fight alongside them. Whether that actually happens or not, I'm not too sure, but that may be an attempt. The administration of the newly merged FATA areas would come under duress, including the provincial government in Peshawar. Lastly, the result in Afghanistan may embolden other militant groups with associated challenges to the stability of some other countries and regions. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of the brotherly people of Afghanistan, and for the sake of Pakistan, and for the sake of the stability of the region, and for the sake of USA, I sincerely hope my pessimistic analysis is proven wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Ashfaq Nadeem Ahmad, for a very comprehensive and a very candid and insightful analysis of the current and emerging dynamics, and also giving your insightful prediction about the future trends. I think where I see your pessimism being shared somewhat by the earlier two speakers, and it seems that all three seem to have a sharing of this concern regarding the adverse likely scenario and its implications for the region and also for Afghan nation. And also particularly for Pakistan, you mentioned that it will have very significant security and other implications that perhaps deserve timely assessment. And that brings me to invite Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani, former Foreign Secretary and my distinguished colleague at CAS, to give his assessment regarding the future of Afghanistan and its geopolitical implications for region and Pakistan. Ambassador Jilani, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Being the last speaker on this excellent panel that had been put together, I wish I could give an upbeat assessment of the evolving situation in Afghanistan. However, unfortunately, the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, as mentioned by the previous two distinguished speakers, my dear friend Marvin Weinbaum and General Ashfaq Nadeem, is certainly fraught with risks and uncertainty. The absence of a national consensus in support of the peace process, which in my view is the most important element to bring about peace and stability in Afghanistan. And this absence of national consensus, coupled with a spurt in violence, the resurgence of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, TTP, and other extremist organizations, and the emergence of foreign-funded militia suggests that we cannot rule out the chances of Afghanistan descending into a greater chaos, or maybe if not greater than of the same kind that we witnessed in the 1990s. The situation is akin to a popular rock song, which I'm sure that Mr. Weinbaum would certainly recall, and that rock song was Bad Moon Rising. This time it appears a bad moon is rising once again over Afghanistan and quite possibly over Pakistan as well. I say this because of a number of factors which have been spelled out very ably by General Ashfaq Nadeem in his presentation. The above perception is further reinforced by Ambassador Khalilzad's appearance in April before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I do not think members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee were assuaged in their many concerns by what he had to say about what happens next in Afghanistan. The testimony of the CIA Director Bill Burns to the Senate Intelligence Committee at the same time, same month, when he spoke about significant risks associated with the US NATO withdrawal, also does not raise the level of confidence within power circles in the United States of America. Similar concerns were also echoed by Secretary Clinton in her interaction with Fareed Zakaria in GPS, where she predicted violence, a potential refugee crisis, which has also been mentioned by other colleagues, and a massive resurgence in terrorism. She also spoke about the possibility of a civil war. Dr. Weinbaum mentioned about the advisory issued by the Australian government and a couple of other governments to their mission to withdraw or to significantly reduce the mission strength in anticipation of the civil war that is likely to take place sooner or later. This is something that this trend will be followed by many other countries because the sense of insecurity is certainly rising with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. A lot of good work had certainly taken place in Afghanistan. There is no doubt about it. While the US, with the help of other countries, they were able to build state institutions, also with the help of the local, factions, groups in Afghanistan. They were able to introduce an electoral process, promote education, empower women, and train Afghan national security forces to some extent. The sustainability of these initiatives certainly remains a significant challenge, owing mainly to the political ambitions of various warlords, the fragmented nature of Afghan polity, ethnic divisions, greed, and outside interference in Afghanistan. All previous internal and external efforts to bring peace and stability to the country have failed. The Peshawar Accord of 1990, the Islamabad Accord of 1992, and the Bonn process of 2002 failed due to the similar reasons. There are serious doubts about the success of the ongoing peace process that is currently at a stalemate. And I agree with General Ashfaq Nadeem, when you talk about a stalemate, that is certainly an advantage for the insurgent groups and not for the government. Perhaps the most important question following the US NATO withdrawal is one of commitment. Commitment by commitment within Afghanistan by various groups to bring about peace and stability in Afghanistan, commitment by the neighboring countries to help with the peace process, and commitment by the US and other countries, European countries, Western countries, to support Afghanistan economically. A number of questions come to mind. Will Taliban and other factions come down from their maximalist positions? The answer, as of now, appears to be no. Will regional countries overcome their temptations to meddle in Afghanistan's internal affairs and contribute to a stable Afghanistan? Again, the answer doesn't give any confidence that this is something that is going to take place, because according to various reports, various warlords in Afghanistan are receiving funds and equipment from other countries to develop their own armies in anticipation of this civil war that everybody is talking about. Will the US and other advanced countries fulfill their economic commitments? Again, this is something which is of paramount importance, because unless money continues to pour into Afghanistan's system, Afghanistan risks degenerating into a state of lawlessness, making way for extremist elements. Based on my personal experience of having served in Washington twice, I would again agree with General Ashfaq Nadeem that it will be extremely difficult for the administration, even if the administration has made any commitment of financial assistance, continued financial assistance. They will not be able to convince the Congress to appropriate funds for Afghanistan. And even if the funds are appropriated for either for the Afghan national security forces, or for that matter, for other institutions, it would be a significantly reduced assistance that Afghanistan will receive. And one is not sure if that assistance would be enough to sustain the institutions that have been so, were established with a lot of efforts on the part of all the countries. Fear from Pakistan's perspective is that despite the acknowledged productive role of Pakistan in the ongoing peace process, There are signals from the US that the blame would lie on Pakistan's doorsteps if the end result in Afghanistan is not achieved according to the script. President Ashraf Ghani, in his article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, Afghanistan's moment of risk and opportunity, has conveniently raised suspicions about Pakistan's role in the peace process, while sidestepping issues internal to Afghanistan. President Ghani's long-standing bias against Pakistan was clearly visible throughout the article, in which he attempts to find a scapegoat for most domestic failures. Having said that, I would say that all is not lost. The situation can still be retrieved. There is room for optimism if the following principles are followed to generate a positive momentum. And some of these factors have also been mentioned by the other distinguished panelists, and I would list those one by one. First is that all sides in Afghanistan should show flexibility for a peaceful future of Afghanistan. A national consensus in support of the peace process is important. Violence must end, and the Afghans must realize that following the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, the major responsibility, rather the entire responsibility, will rest on Afghan shoulders themselves. They will have to basically put their own house in order. They have to realize the mistakes. They have to basically bring about a national consensus and also work for the development of their economy and the development of the institutions which have already been established there. Secondly, efforts must be made by all Afghan groups in putting together a government of national unity. The Taliban seem amenable to the idea of an interim government and have reportedly reached out to Mr. Abdullah and other Afghan leaders. If true, there can certainly be an opportunity that can be carved out in case there is a government of Afghan national unity, and it's an inclusive government in Afghanistan. And I agree with the previous panelists that Taliban are not going to accept either the elections under the current dispensation or under the current constitution. Thirdly, political factions in Kabul, other than the government and Taliban, must come forward in playing a constructive role in diffusing tension. So far, it appears as if it is Taliban versus the Afghan government. It appears that, as was rightly pointed out, that the initiative was had already slipped out of the Afghan government's hand in order to have an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led peace initiative. But then that is something that can certainly be retrieved in case the other neutral groups in Afghanistan, they play their role. Fourthly, willingness of the outside powers, in particular the US, Russia, and Pakistan, China, India, Iran, to exert themselves for peace and discourage violence. India must confine its role to legitimate limits. I would like to clarify that contrary to what President Karzai mentioned in his Der Spiegel interview day before yesterday, that Pakistan wanted Afghanistan to cut off relations with Afghanistan, there is absolutely no truth in it. I have been part of many negotiations at the highest level. At no stage did Pakistan ever ask Afghanistan to cut off relations with India. As a matter of fact, Pakistan does not really serve Pakistan's interests that relations between Afghanistan and other countries are cut off. It is Afghanistan's sovereign decision. The only request or demand that used to be made by Pakistan was that that India should not be allowed to exploit their presence in Afghanistan to destabilize Pakistan or to provide assistance, all kinds of assistance to groups who were trying to destabilize Pakistan. So that was something. And then formation of private militias. I think this is again an important issue. According to recent reports, there is a kind of a surge of such militias. A number of warlords are also approaching other countries in order to get their assistance in anticipation of a civil war. Outside powers contributing to formation of such militias must resist the temptation to do so. A civil war is not in the interest of Afghanistan or its neighbors, for it will provide space to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, TTP, etc., to exploit the situation to their advantage. Sixthly, the promise of substantive international economic support is critical to sustain the process. It will raise the morale of the morale and confidence of the Afghan population, and for survival of institutions established so far. Economic assistance would also prevent the exodus of Afghanistan to other neighboring countries. So this is something which is of critical importance. And lastly, regional countries must stay away from the internal military and political dynamics of Afghanistan and confine their role to the economic well-being of the people of Afghanistan. Lastly, I would mention that whatever the outcome of the peace process in Afghanistan, it is imperative for Pakistan to continue to display the same level of commitment towards Afghanistan, Afghanistan's peace and stability that it is displaying so far. A secure and stable Afghanistan is a necessary condition for Pakistan's geo-economic and security interests. At the same time, contingency planning will be needed on our part to deal with massive inflow of refugees into Pakistan and prevent the infiltration of anti-Pakistan elements into the country. The accompanying attacks on our security forces and civilians could prove disastrous for, they prove a lot of risk for Pakistan and has raised a lot of concerns in Pakistan. Pakistan will need to fortify its security arrangements along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border and enhancing surveillance and intelligence protocol to monitor, track, and arrest militants. Pakistan can continue to play an important role in support of the peace process, in supporting peace and stability in Afghanistan, but we must be prepared for any and all repercussions of a swift withdrawal, which also has its downside as far as the situation in Afghanistan is concerned. Thank you so much.
Sir, bahut shukriya. Thank you so much. I think we've had a very comprehensive review of not only the current dynamics, but also the emerging trends. But one thing which probably struck a common chord with all the four speakers is that I see a lot of pessimism. And although all four speakers have attempted to give some suggestions, some valuable ideas that how this caution can be mitigated with some responsible and timely contribution by international community, region, and also the Afghan stakeholders. We have slightly overshot time, so due to the paucity of time, I'd now request the chair of this session to allow me to start the Q&A session. Sir Farhad, can we start the Q&A session, please?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. We'll try to have a short and sweet question and answer session for about 15 minutes. We have lots of questions, which is an evidence that a lot of people have been watching this very interesting and intense discussion, and a lot of questions we have received. We have a couple of questions, so I'll try to club them together and I'll appreciate if the panelists can give brief answers so that we can finish in time. There are two questions from, if General Ashfaq can have a go at it, and I'll club them together. A gentleman has asked that why Pakistan is, how Pakistan can avoid being blamed in case of after the US departure. And secondly, do you think Pakistan has agreed to use its military bases? General Ashfaq?
The answer to the first question is Pakistan cannot avoid it. Short answer is with regard to the blame.
Yes, sir.
Because the USA has ceded all control by announcing a date and leaving. So there will be greater blame game on Pakistan. So I don't think you can avoid it. Most of it, in my opinion, would be wrong, but you can't avoid it. Second question was, sorry, what was the second question?
So second, that do you think Pakistan has agreed or will agree to give bases?
I never said that. I don't know. I have no idea. So even the one which I was telling with regard to airlines of communication is my assessment, and which is often wrong. So, no, I don't know.
Thank you, sir. I think a related question from Professor Weinbaum. Air Marshal Ashfaq has asked that why do you think Pakistan is blamed for everything that goes wrong in Afghanistan? Is it political reason or is it, some other reason?
Well, when you set your sights here on a faraway goal and you don't succeed, naturally you look around for some reason to explain it. It happens in this context. It happens so often with countries whose own failures are better explained as far as they're concerned by saying, well, that's somebody else's doing, not our own. Let me just say one thing in this regard, though, that Pakistan, in a way, set itself up for this kind of blame, in part by, on one hand, saying that we have a lot of influence, we can bring the Taliban to the table, well, look at all we've accomplished, and at the same time say, well, we really don't have that much in the way of influence. So Pakistan has taken both sides of this, both showing its ability to get to the Taliban and at the same time trying to lower expectations about what it can actually accomplish. Let me just say one more thing in this. No one has been able to, and that includes Pakistan above all, nobody has been able to get the Taliban to change their position on those aspects of their demands, beliefs, in which they are core to their position. They have agreed on the margins, but you have to give them an A for consistency here, in that they have stood firm, in part because they have seen that by standing firm, we generally get what we want. And this negotiation process, such as it's happened up to this point, has been a demonstration of this repeatedly, that the Taliban did not yield. It was the government, it was the United States that yielded.
Okay, a related question, Professor Weinbaum. Since you mentioned, I think Mahin Shafiq has asked this question, that
I think Ambassador Jalali wanted to say something.
Yeah, while Pakistan gets excessive blame whenever something is wrong in Afghanistan or certain objectives are not achieved, don't you think Pakistan, US can play a role in ensuring that some of Pakistan's concerns regarding Indian involvement in Afghanistan can be addressed? Can US do something about it?
Who is this directed to?
Yeah, I'm asking you that since Pakistan gets a lot of blame game, do you think in return for facilitation for the US military withdrawal, do you think that US can play some role in addressing Pakistan's security concerns regarding Indian involvement in Afghanistan, particularly the aspects that Ambassador Gilani pointed out?
Yeah, no, look, the United States has, again, the United States does not have that kind of leverage here. At the same time, I do believe that the United States has recognized that Pakistan has these feelings about India's role and has cautioned India, but I didn't think it really had to. India's behavior on at least on the public side of it here has been very careful here not to give Pakistan more ammunition than it needs to. At the same time, to the degree that things are done more surreptitiously, I don't think the United States is going to have very much influence.
Thank you so much.
Ali, since it's an important question which is being raised by the participants about blame game that would sort of ensue in case Afghanistan descends into chaos. I remember that a couple of years ago, I went to attend a seminar on Afghanistan in the National Defense College, NATO Defense College in Rome. And one Russian scholar made a very pertinent remark about the blame game. He said that who would where can we lay the blame? There are mainly three parties. One is the United States of America and the West. Secondly, it is Afghanistan. And thirdly, it is Pakistan, because these are the countries who could be blamed for the current mess in Afghanistan. He said that the US, will they accept the blame? No, the US will not accept the blame, because after having spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan, and after having lost so many people in Afghanistan, soldiers in Afghanistan, an acceptance of blame by the United States would be disastrous for the government, for the administration, for the Congress, and for various other institutions. What about Afghanistan? He said that Afghanistan, no, the Afghans will also not accept the blame, because they'll say that neither the economic, we had the economic strength, nor the military strength to avoid the kind of situation that we are faced with. So our security was the responsibility of other countries. Our economy was also the responsibility of other countries. So accordingly, blame cannot be put on Afghanistan's doorstep. He said that the only country which can be conveniently blamed is Pakistan, because it won't have the ability to defend itself against such blames. So it was a very interesting remark that he made. And I tend to agree with him that that this is, we hope that people, they begin to realize the kind of internal problems that Afghanistan is faced with, because they are the ones who probably will be responsible. We hope that that situation is avoided, but that is the kind of a situation that can emerge.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. Farhadi, there's an interesting question from Ms. Sidra Shahid for you, that almost 12 dams are being built on Kabul River. Do you think this could become an issue between Pakistan and Afghanistan in future, and you expect the future Afghan government to address it?
Yes. We know that Pakistan has a future water problem, perhaps a current water problem. We also know that Iran has a water problem. In southeastern Iran, the drought has already affected the situation. And it affects the situation by affecting people, livelihoods, jobs, and through a peaceful situation with Afghanistan, which, as the speakers have described, that it's difficult to foresee. But if there was peace, all that can be negotiated in a way that there's a give and take between all these countries. That yes, the massive mountains in Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush mountain, does produce water, snow, water, and in a way, Afghanistan is sitting on this resource which is valuable for Pakistan. But if there is no peace in Afghanistan, none of that can materialize.
All right, thank you. I think there's a question, another question from Mr. Fahim Malik for you. When will Afghan current government or leadership realize that no one is their friend or foe more than themselves? So US came for their own interests, stayed for it, and now leaving for its own interests. Even Pakistan desires peace in Afghanistan. So when shall Afghan unity government start treating and engaging Taliban as fellow Afghans? Being government, they have to bend over backwards and extend the hand of friendship and peace. Do you see some prospects of some thaw between Taliban and Kabul, sir?
It's difficult, to be sincere. It's difficult. There's a lot of bad history now between the Taliban and the Afghan government. The Afghan people, it's a different story. They want peace. They have paid the price. Who died? 241,000 Afghans died. In this conflict, 80,000 soldiers over the 20 years, perhaps 60, 70,000 civilians. On the Taliban side, there has been casualties. So the total has been, the people want peace. We have a lot of families, families with 4 or 5 children. Who is going to take care of them? The people want peace now. Of course they want peace. The government has conditions, and the conditions are, as previous speakers have mentioned, are difficult for the Taliban to accept. And the Taliban need to make themselves acceptable to the Afghan people. Let's not forget that they have exploded bombs in the center of Kabul. They have put bombs in ambulances, and they have driven into hospitals, the Jamhuriyat hospital. They have, those are the attacks that they have admitted. And also because of the overall situation, Daesh and so many other groups, and we have not seen the end of it. So yes, if there is an honorable peace between all the Afghans, it's possible, but I am in agreement with our distinguished speakers that the peace is difficult. In my presentation, I have tried to make the point, what kind of a neighbor Pakistan wants? Does it want a neighbor in chaos? Where none of these promises can be fulfilled and chaos could seep into Pakistan. Extremism, terrorism, and blame, international blame. We have talked about blame. There is a way to fix the blame, to put pressure on Taliban now and minimize them so that they...
Can I ask a related question? Because we are short of time, so I'll have to apologize to a lot of people because I have a lot of questions, but I don't think we have enough time. I'll have to request our chair to give his concluding remarks shortly. So I'll take last 3 questions. Major General Muhammad Ali has asked that, don't you think that, and this question is addressed to General Ashfaq, that without the US financial commitment, don't you think Afghan will again rely more on the drugs trade, and this will create problem for the region and Afghanistan?
Whether they rely on drugs or not, but obviously without financial aid for the next few years, till such time that the Afghans stand up on their own feet economically. So there are challenges, obviously. The US has made some commitments that they would continue to remain involved financially But as Ambassador Jalani was also saying, I have my doubt that the Congress would approve that, and they would begin to depend on various other means. And drugs could be one of them, yes.
Okay. There's a question from Mr. Nasir Hafiz. Dr. Weinbaum, if you can briefly answer this question. Do you see any role for UN peacekeeping force after US withdrawal?
The only way one can conceive of a UN role is if there is some kind of agreement. The idea that the UN can in any way provide the kind of pressure on the parties that would lead them to some kind of agreement, I don't think that's in the cards. But it's not just the UN and all of the other countries, as I'm saying, only they can make peace work. But first you have to have an agreement. And finally on this, the reason why I'm pessimistic is that as we look at the history of Afghanistan, or the recent history of Afghanistan, there's been no time in this stretch when the Afghans themselves have been able to settle their problems. They've either left them unresolved or some outside force has come in and forced some kind of peace, only to have it turn into another phase of civil war. So the look is not one which is favorable, but again, I want to stress that others are going to make peace work. It's going to be the Afghans themselves that have to make it possible. And at the moment, that's not very promising.
Thank you. Dr. Farhadi, if you can have a quick shot at this question regarding what do Afghans expect in terms of the possible role by China in promoting peace and stability in Afghanistan?
China has been a little bit further afield from all of this. It has made positive declarations. We know that China would be interested in the minerals in Afghanistan, but China knows something. It knows that Afghanistan is not going anywhere. So it could come in 10 years, in 15 years, the minerals will still be there if there is a chaos and civil war in Afghanistan. So China has not involved itself militarily in any country in the world, I would say. It has not. China's arrival, including in Pakistan, and you can take the example of Sri Lanka, Montenegro, and many African countries, is economical, basically. They come on a very friendly basis, they make big loans, and after that, it's sort of a rope around our necks. So, but China doesn't have at this time military designs in Afghanistan or anywhere for now. They have won basically the economic battle.
Thank you. Last question, I think my colleague Sitara Noor has asked an interesting question, Professor Weinbaum. How do you think the nature of US-Pakistan relationship will be after the changing US priorities in Afghanistan?
I think it all depends on what happens in Afghanistan. That's the big question mark here. I think the United States recognizes that there can be no peace in Afghanistan, and certainly there can be the possibility of peace. This is impossible without Pakistan. So there's a realization of Pakistan is the key player here in the periphery. So again, how things transpire in Afghanistan will, I believe, determine much of the future of US-Pakistan relations.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll have to apologize on behalf of the entire CAST team because we have received lots of questions that I don't think, due to paucity of time, we'll be able to address. So my sincere apologies. And now I'd like to invite the chair of today's webinar, Deputy President of CAS, Air Marshal Farhat Hussain Khan, to deliver his concluding address. Air Marshal Farhat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sayyid Muhammad Ali. Very interesting exhibition of the entire process. To conclude, what I understand from the four speakers, there is a commonality in understanding that we are, possibly the region is starting Afghanistan, the region is up into disturbance, turmoil, and instability. If that happens, that would deny Afghanistan the most, and of course, Pakistan, the much needed revival of the economic activity towards Kars, Iran, and upwards. So I think while there is, the scenario is not too, doesn't appear so good, but there are hopes and displayed by most of the speakers. With that, I'll come to my conclusions of today's proceedings. Gentlemen, withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan was expected to bring with it a hope for the much needed peace for the region in general, and Pakistan and Afghanistan in particular. As peaceful environment is the bare minimum requirement for opening trade/energy routes. With all the hopes, the situation seems unveiling with serious challenges that would need timely response with peace as the common objective of the region. By all stakeholders, with that I mean Afghanistan, all factions, Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia, Kars. While the US may not be there on ground, it would continue to impact the post-withdrawal scenario. Afghan government and Taliban rivalry is likely to be the major spoiler on this account. Therefore, for any worthwhile dividend, the Afghans' internal fighting has to come to an end with all groups as partners in peace and prosperity. India, with or without help of other forces, would certainly continue its negativity and keep exploiting the disturbance. Disturbance in Pakistan with an aim to dominate the region by degrading Pakistan's economy, causing strategic imbalance by posing two-dimensional threat, and above all, disrupt CPAC. Pakistan, therefore, needs to prepare well for the post-withdrawal scenario. Allow me to say, if experience was to be a guide, peace and stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan is not expected to be priority of the forces that are located too far away. It is a main issue with the region. In view of the following, I have a few recommendations to make. First and foremost, being a major stakeholder of peace in Afghanistan, Pakistan must continue to pursue its policy of peace and regional stability as a grand policy objective, with all her elements of national power fully supporting the concept. Regional stakeholders, that is Pakistan, China, Iran, Turkey, Kars, must work together to encourage Taliban and other elements, including Afghan government, to sort out their differences and become partners in peace. Through a mutually agreed Afghan-owned process for power sharing formula, These countries must also agree and work together to pursue a mutually beneficial common objective of regional peace. This would help develop trade routes and energy corridors for mutual benefit. And let me say, the concept of proxies as seen in 90s must be a thing of the past to move forward. In case of serious turmoil in Afghanistan, Pakistan is to prepare itself for a large-scale influx of refugees, as mentioned by other speakers, along the border, as well as inside Pakistan. Anticipatory measures would help mitigate the effects of refugees on Pakistan's internal security, economy, and social structure. CPAC, being on the hit list of a few countries, would need continuous watch for security of its infrastructure and technical manpower. To ensure its success, CPAC to be guarded closely. Economy and connectivity of energy corridors may be agreed as a common interest for all regional stakeholders. And in my view, Afghanistan and its neighbors may be offered to join CPAC to promote peace. In case the void in Afghanistan gets serious, India may activate our eastern borders or the line of control to divert attention of Pakistan's security forces. To ward off such threats, Pakistan is to keep stakeholders in confidence through mutual consultation on important developments. Therefore, I recommend that rather than a mutual diplomacy between Pakistan and Afghanistan, it has to be a multilateral diplomacy that may work. Intelligence sharing with US forces or its infrastructure should form part of operational handling for better situation awareness and preemptive remedial measures. Must try and preserve mutually beneficial close relationship with the United States. When the disturbance, if it comes, I hope it doesn't, some sympathizers of ISIS or Taliban in Pakistan may like to create disturbance in Pakistan. So therefore, Pakistan on its account got to watch for these forces and handle these forces with firm hand. And lastly, in my view, our media happens to be a weak link in promoting Pakistan's national interest. There was a desperate need to formulate a media strategy for opinion making at different levels and projection of national interests both within and outside Pakistan. With that, I come to the end of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Air Marshal Farhad, for concluding this very rich, intense, and comprehensive webinar on a very thought-provoking note, and generating and sharing some very important ideas for the international community and our friends and leadership to consider. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. It's a great honor on behalf of the CAS leadership team, researchers, IT staff, administration, to thank you all, particularly the illustrious panel for sparing their time from United States, from Geneva, and from other parts of the country to share their knowledge and insight and assessment of this very critical and timely issue, and making this webinar a success. I'm also very indebted to all our friends who joined us from around the world in this webinar on Zoom, as well as on other social media platforms, and shared their valuable comments, and also contributed through some very important and enlightening questions. I apologize again because there are almost 29 questions which remain unanswered, but because of us overshooting time a little, we could not address that. But I'm sure you will continue to engage with this forum on this platform, which will continue to offer timely, rich, thought-provoking debates on international, regional, and national security issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank everybody and conclude on this point that basically all four speakers raised and expressed concerns about the emerging and likely scenario of Afghanistan. However, it's a critical and fleeting moment for the international community, for the regional powers, and for all Afghan stakeholders to show maturity and responsibility and learn from costly mistakes and work as the chair suggested in the end, and work as partners in peace so that the Afghan nation and this region and the world recovers from past mistakes and develop a progressive and peaceful future for this country and for this region. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and Khuda Hafiz and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.